that if we transcend, if we can go beyond the ladder, everything stands aright. So there is a provision in Wittgenstein for going beyond. This is what I would like to emphasize upon. So in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein talked about three sorts of things that lie beyond the limits of language. If we can identify, Wittgenstein confessed language cannot represent the logical form of reality. This he confessed, that language cannot represent the logical form of reality. Though he talked so much about the form of propositions, form of language, but that is not expressible in language. Propositions cannot represent logical form, it is mirrored in them. Propositions show the logical form of reality, they display it. Secondly, Wittgenstein talked about the realm of language. And finally, itself is the member of the domain of science. All
Yes.
these are not expressible in language. So these are all placed in the domain of silence, and so also is the.
Actually, we lost you for a minute or so. Could you please?
Why this is happening? I
I do
can't.
not know. Maybe as Samasri was saying, bad weather sometimes affect. So
Yes, we lost you several times, Didi.
but it was going on well.
Several times.
No, no. Here only for a minute. You can just repeat those three
Okay,
things.
okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm going out, and then again, I'm just for a moment. I'm going out, and again I'll enter. I'll let me find out what is the
No,
problem.
no, no. I think we are fine. We can hear you now.
Yes,
Now
it
it's
is.
it's
It
fine.
is
I
just
think
in between for few
yes.
seconds it breaks down, then it comes.
You were talking
Oh,
about how the propositions they show the form, they display the form, and then we
Yeah.
lost you.
oh. That's it. Just for a moment, I'll check the connection.
Sure, sure, sure.
What is happening there? I don't know. It is showing, everything is showing all right. It is showing all right, but I don't know what is happening.
Okay, you may start.
It is. It is
Yes,
showing.
right.
It is not showing anything there in the line.
That's
It
okay.
is showing
That's okay.
everything. I don't know.
That's
Something
okay.
is happening, but something is happening, but I don't know what.
Yeah, it sometimes happens. I mean, online things are like that.
The thing that I was trying to explain. So for uh, I got lost. What I was saying. Oh yes.
You are talking about the.
I have so many papers. I have so many papers, newspapers lying here and there.
That's okay.
So for Wittgenstein, in the Tractarian phase, especially for Wittgenstein, all language are one and the same as far as their essence is concerned. As there cannot be any language which is illogical. Logic is wholly present in any language that makes sense. For if a language does not have any language then that is not to be considered as a language at all. Actually, this is the stand to which it finally leads. That is the language, that is logic of the language. The language which Wittgenstein is trying to present as the language of philosophy, that will be a kind of universal language, because it will capture the logic of the language. So in that sense, the language, if anything, or if any language does not have any logic, then that is not language. Actually, though he didn't say so many things in words, but this is the underlying implication, that is, logic determines the language. But at the same time, that there is other than this language, and so there is no possibility for any conception of the world other than this world which is provided by this language. Now, this is my language determines my world. Actually, my language is not here any private language, but the language which I am using, the language, universal language, which is here my language, and that determines the sense, and that determines sense in the world. And so, he draws an analogy of my visual field, for it is without any second. So, my language, here the expression, two ways of interpreting the clause, the world is my world, this is manifest in the fact that the limits of language, of that language which alone I understand, mean the limits of my world. Wittgenstein wrote in 5.62. And two ways of interpreting it. It refers to a private language, and it refers to one and only language I speak. And in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein was speaking for a language which is logical language, that is language of the logic, which will be the universal language, in the sense that it will capture the logic which is beneath each and every versions of language. So my language here is not any private language, but it refers to one and only language that Wittgenstein is providing in the Tractatus. And his analogy with the visual field is also known to us. And in this connection, Wittgenstein draws entails the existence of two radically different kinds of things, the subject of experience and the object of experience. How are we to make sense of the notion of subject of experience? Now, one of the controversial terms in Wittgenstein's Tractatus is metaphysische subject. And on closer scrutiny, it is clear that Wittgenstein is actually not contradicting himself, for there is a sense in which he upholds a subject and there is a sense in which he rejects it. He introduces the notion of a philosophical self or a metaphysical self as distinguished from the notion of a psychological self. Wittgenstein does not make a room for a thinking, knowing, experiencing metaphysical self, for in his opinion there is no such entity. For him there is subject, is not in the world, but it is a limit of the world. That is, here for Wittgenstein, the subject of experience is the limit of the world. Now, another point here, that this subject, without being a subject, there cannot be demarcation of limit of the world. So, subject here is not any psychological subject, but subject here stands for the very condition of, it is one of the conditionality of making the world as world. That is, it is the conditionality. And so the subject here does not belong to the world, but it is limit to the world. Of course, here Wittgenstein is not after any subject in that sense, that any psychological subject who will have access to the world in a we can say in a kind of encounter with the world in that sense. So here an important, thus metaphysical subject is identified with the totality of one's language and the limits of the language with the limits of the world. So the totality of the language, one's language, that is the subject, and limits of the language with the limits of the world. Now, in this connection, I would also like to draw attention when Wittgenstein was talking about tautology and contradiction. Now, tautology and contradiction, according to Wittgenstein, they do not occupy a space in logical space. But tautology provides the scaffolding of the world. And he would say that it does not provide as a logic, because logic is, in a sense, logic aims at tautology, truth. And in that sense, it provides the scaffolding of the world. And so, the metaphysical subject here, we may say, has been identified with the totality of one's language and the limits of the language with the limits of the world. Now, Schloss-Berger remarks quite rightly, thus, there is only one metaphysical subject. The intentionality of language itself, and it is equally common to everything. It bears no special relation to my body. It has been further remarked by Schloss-Berger, the subject resides in language itself. The limit of the subject, that is the limit, the subject that brings in the very awareness of limitation, it is in the language. So the subject resides in language itself, not in the functioning of some bodily organism. And Wittgenstein took language to be inherently intentional. A sentence is a picture of something by its inherent intentionality. And what Schloss-Berger emphasizes is that Wittgenstein is not merely drawing our attention to the isomorphism, between the language and the world, but also to eager to establish intentionality of language. To quote Schloss-Berger, language is intentional. It reaches up. It feels, projects, agrees, signifies, and is applied. This is not to say that someone applies language, that someone uses language. The intentionality does not reside in some speaker or utterer who uses or applies a language. Rather, it is inherent in language. So actually, the limit, to be aware of the limit, in one way or other, the other side of the limit has to be posited. And position comes from the very intentionality of language, because it is achieved by language. Language consists in its this kind of inherent intentionality. Now in this connection I would also like to quote quote a line from Ray Monk. He writes, his logic and his thinking about himself became two aspects of the single duty to oneself. To carry on thinking in the line of Russell and Frege, supported logical path, and also thinking about the transcendental in the light of writings, Gospel in Brief of Tolstoy. In fact, he engaged himself in the First World War, and he spent long time in the war camp, and he was there in the trenches when he finished his writing Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. We all know all these details. And at the same time, when he was in the battlefield, the book that was always with him was Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief. And he also admitted that this is the only book that saved him from all his difficulties and we can say depressions. And so this Gospel in Brief of Tolstoy was really a great asset to Wittgenstein. And this also gives rise to a very pertinent question as to whether it is possible to grasp a philosophical standpoint as divorced from the mentality that has given birth to it, its cultural and social atmosphere. This is also one of the very important questions which seems to me really unavoidable. And another thing, now in recent times we come across different reading of the Tractatus, and especially different reading of nonsense. And in this connection, there are two very large we can say versions of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. One follows the standard interpretation, and the other is of the resolute readers. Now, among the resolute readers, there are strong voices who strongly criticize Wittgenstein's stand in the Tractatus and try to link it with his stand with the stand of philosophical investigations. Now, this section I thought I won't touch, but I would only just very, very briefly, I would touch only to some of the lines. Otherwise, it will remain incomplete. Now, among the resolute readers, James Conant and Cora Diamond now initially brought out interpreting the Tractatus, and which later, of course, assumed a huge proportion. Now, Cora Diamond, in her seminal article, Throwing Away the Ladder, in his realistic spirit, first outlines what would be called the resolute reading of the Tractatus. The main contention is once the ladder is thrown away, one comes to realize that Tractatus does not show us something about the world or language. And Thomas Ricketts has been given the credit for introducing the term resolute reading. And according to Conant and Diamond, that this remark of the Tractatus, that my propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them as steps to climb up beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. Now, according to Conant and Diamond, this remark, when interpreted in an irresolute way that is not read as per their suggestion, taken to mean that the illusory proposition of the Tractatus, even though strictly speaking nonsensical, are nonetheless capable of conveying ineffable insights into the nature of reality. So, thought and language, and according to them, the irresolute interpreters, even though admit that the propositions of the Tractatus are eventually nonsense, but then this readers chicken out. Chicken out is a term used by Cora Diamond and claims that they communicate some special sort of content. A resolute reading of 6.54, on the contrary, maintains that sentences that compose the body of the text are to be considered as simply nonsensical, and these sentences that constitute the whole text a string of words and fail to convey any content. So, James Conant and Cora Diamond, in their article on reading the Tractatus resolutely, they write as follows. Wittgenstein in the Tractatus gives voice to an aspiration that is central to his later philosophy, well before he becomes later Wittgenstein, when he writes in 4.112 of the Tractatus that philosophy is not a matter of putting forward a doctrine or a theory, but consists rather in the practice of an activity as he goes on to characterize as one of elucidation or clarification, an activity which does not result in propositions of philosophy, but rather in our attaining clarity in our relation to the sentences of a language that we call upon to express our thought. Now, to say that early Wittgenstein aspired to such a conception of philosophy is not to contradict that to aspire to practice philosophy in such a manner in if one in Wittgenstein's thinking as philosophy, and why it is that he wanted the Tractatus to be published and read together, what a sort of failure that is, and that requires coming to terms with Tractatus's own understanding of what sort of work it was truly.